Good morning, everybody. I'm most honored to open this morning session and welcome you all to our European Computer Science Summit, ECSS main conference. And this morning we will have two keynotes speakers. The topic is about diversity in informatics research and education. And we will have, the session is chaired by myself and Letizia. So first, let's go through the netiquette for our Zoom conference. Please make sure that you have your full name in your Zoom account. For the discussions, during the presentations, please make sure to mute your microphone when you are not speaking, avoid the unnecessary noises. For the Q&A and discussion session, we will use a mixture of raise hand features so that you can ask yourself, then please say who you are first. And we will also be monitoring the Zoom chat for the questions. So you can write down the questions. The session will look like this, that we will have two speakers with a small break in between. So Ewan Birney and Vivian Anette Lagesen will be speaking. So it's my pleasure to start introducing Ewan. My own name, I did not say my name, I'm Jaak Vilo, head of the Institute of Computer Science at University of Tartu, Estonia. I am a member of Informatics Europe board, and in this role, I'm very happy to introduce Ewan Birney. Ewan Birney is one of the two joint directors of EMBL, European Bioinformatics Institute, next to Cambridge in the UK. And this summer, he also became a Deputy Director General of EMBL. I'm not sure if everybody knows EMBL, but EMBL is a CERN-like intergovernmental, interdisciplinary research organization for life sciences. So they are developing technologies, different services, and of course, conducting world-class research. Ewan himself is one of the top researchers in the field of computational biology / bioinformatics, because these are kind of synonyms. Starting from early days of his own PhD research, he has been instrumental in the area of genome sequencing, analysis, and interpretation. He is also a current chair of Global Alliance for Genomics and Health. Ewan Birney has been a strong advocate for open science, global data sharing, and open source software, for which he has received several international awards from the societies. Ewan Birney is a fellow of the Royal Society in the UK and fellow of the Academy of Medical Sciences from 2014 and 15. I believe he considers himself primarily a biologist, but his field of research is very much about data science, using and developing methods for complex data engineering and analysis, as well as a lot of machine learning. Given all this personal experience and background, he is very well suited to talk to us about the international, multicultural, multidisciplinary research organization, for which I believe computer science, as well as diversity in general, has played such a crucial role. Please, Ewan, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And I will now share my screen. If we can share. Here we go. So Jaak, can you just confirm that this is all set up right on your side?
Everything is fine.
Perfect. Okay. So first off, thank you to Letizia, Enrico, Jaak, and everyone else who invited me on as a keynote. It really is a pleasure to talk to you virtually, the new world of virtual. And it's a pleasure to kind of perhaps introduce this area of science and the particular institution I'm involved with, but perhaps just remind you of this. And I would go back to the fact that biology is truly a data science now. We are one of the most data intensive sciences around. We generate data and have to analyze data. And this actually goes back to some of the foundations of statistics. R.A. Fisher, for example, developed his hypothesis testing, his understanding of the normal distribution, and his analysis of variance precisely to study the biological genetics that he was looking at the time. So Jaak briefly touched on the organization that I'm actually second in command of, the Deputy Director General, the European Molecular Biology Laboratory. It is very much a sort of child or sister sibling of CERN. We were founded in 1974, or 1973 was when the treaty was signed, in Geneva, in CERN, very much on the same principles. And our headquarters is in Heidelberg, Germany. But very early on, it was clear that biology was going to need a diverse set of tools, and some of those tools were high-energy physics tools. So these synchrotrons, this very source of very intense X-ray light. And therefore, there are outstations in Germany, in Hamburg, and in France, in Grenoble. And then over the 80s, predating much of the development of the internet, was the sharing of DNA and protein structures worldwide. And that started at EMBL in Heidelberg, but rapidly outgrew the buildings in Heidelberg. And in fact, there was a competition in the late 80s about which country should host the next outstation of EMBL. And the UK won that competition. And founded the European Bioinformatics Institute was founded just south of Cambridge in Hingston. It's a kind of old country house just south of Cambridge. And then later on, two other laboratories were added in the 1990s. EMBL Rome, just outside of Rome in Monterotondo, focusing now on neurobiology and epigenetics. And then our latest edition has been EMBL Barcelona on the beach. Amazingly, it's really rather beautiful, focusing on organoids tissues. So this is how we're distributed across Europe. We're truly, like CERN, a truly European organization. And we are funded, we are owned by 27 different member states and 2 associate member states. So the 27 member states are from Europe, which includes Israel. Estonia is a prospect member state. Maybe that's converted now. And you can see that basically nearly all of Europe is part of EMBL. And that reaches out to even to Israel. One of the interesting aspects, going to Jaak's point of diversity, is that in its founding definition in the 1974, we have a turnover model. Everyone in EMBL has a fixed term. A small proportion of people at the end of their fixed term can continue, but it must be legally below 15% and in practice is below 10%. And most importantly, our best scientists go. Those people who stay on are not our best ones. The best scientists leave. Jaak is one example of that. And this turnover model means that we replace the personnel of EMBL very regularly. And I'm just showing here how that's happened. The purple these are all the faculty members across EMBL, and the purple indicates the people who have joined, and the red indicates the people who have left. There's been a very slight increase, but you can see that there's a remarkably high level of turnover in terms of who have joined and who have left. We have 5 different missions across EMBL to do excellent fundamental research, to deliver infrastructure and services, and that includes data services, and I'm going to spend some time on that, to provide advanced training in a variety of ways, to work with industry, and to help the European research area flourish in the life sciences. And in some sense, there is a strong loop here between research, where we're sort of asking questions about specific bits of life sciences. Those often stimulate technology development and development of fundamental technologies for measuring and observing life. And both of these impact our services, both experimental and data services, where people from across Europe can come and use either our equipment or our data resources. And EMBL EBI, the organization which I'm director of, is the world's foremost data hub when people in biomolecular data. So when people talk about the public human genome or the public mouse genome, when people talk about public biological data, the vast majority of that is held by us just south of Cambridge in the UK in this European organization. We synchronize with our colleagues in America and Japan every night. That was very important in the 1980s and 1990s when the internet was not so pervasive across the world. That has become less important these days. Anybody in the world, and this is a picture of a snapshot of the day about who is using us on a particular day. Each bubble is somebody using us. But actually, we still work in a global collaborative way because it is a global science. Understanding life is a global science. And it does need all the scientists around the world. And the pandemic is showing the importance of that global mindset. Huge numbers of people use us. Huge numbers of people deposit data to us. And huge numbers of data flows back out of us. There are occasions where we are the single largest outbound amount of data from the UK, where our servers provide more than 50% of the traffic on the internet on some days come from us. EMBL EBI, in terms of those data resources, were organized by different areas of molecular biology. A very iconic one is the genomes. The human genome, for example, is an iconic kind of hard drive of life. But that hard drive is very hard to read and interpret. And what happens in biology is we also measure many, many other aspects of how life works. The genes, the molecules that are produced by the genome, how they fold up into three-dimensional structures, and how they work together. And each of these little words here represents one area of molecular biology where a team is working with the community to store the data being generated worldwide. Now, each one of them, it deserves a 1-hour talk, and I'm not going to go into that, so I'm going to give you some highlights for this. So a very new resource, or well, a somewhat new resource, is the Bioimage Archive, the ability to archive images. Imaging over the last 10 years have become really, really remarkable, and there's two drivers to this. One is new technology, and in the middle slide here, I'm showing one of those new technologies, which is cryo-EM. We are able to see at near atomic scale resolution in situ molecules. It is quite remarkable, and that's the business of using electrons as light and then recording literally the impact of those electrons on a detector in a very, very sensitive way. The second one, amazing technology, is this thing called super resolution microscopy. This is where you trade resolution in time to gain resolution of space, but using photons. And because of that trade-off between time and space resolution, you can actually go below the wavelength limit in space resolution. So this sounds like you're breaking a law of physics. You're not, you're just doing a trade-off. And that's basically about the fact that the molecules don't move that fast in many situations. So this allows you to get a below wavelength limit resolution. But the other huge benefit, I just want to check, is everything okay, Jaak? Because something flashed up on my screen. Looks like it. And the other huge benefit in images, it has been the development of machine learning. So these deep neural networks, that has transformed the ability for us to extract information from images. Whereas previously, nearly always, you had to have a human operator look at these images and decide what was going on and maybe place some landmarks around them. And that was very, very difficult to automate. We now can do much of that using machine learning. And of course, these data types combine in very, very complicated ways. This now in the middle there is showing one of our favorite organisms, which is the marine worm, the Platinarius. And here, many different techniques are being brought together to understand how this particular organism works, both imaging and omics techniques, so DNA and RNA and proteomics techniques. And that requires real innovation in data science. I'm going to step in a moment to one of those bits which have come from my own group, actually probably less innovative than to what I'm showing at the moment. But I just want to say some of this is sort of classic multivariate statistics. So on the left-hand side, this is using a linear mixed model to understand gene by environment effects in a clever way where you don't have to define the environment in such a sophisticated manner, which is great. But on the right-hand side is a different type of innovation. This is actually taking a very standard piece of 1970s epidemiological statistics. So Cox's partial likelihoods, proportional hazard model, and using Cox's partial likelihood method, but mapping that onto one of these very modern frameworks. So in this case, it's TensorFlow, though I think they've moved it to PyTorch, which sits on top of TensorFlow. I always get a little bit lost here. Because of this piece of innovation in data science engineering, they have been able to use these methods, very classical 1970 methods, but on 10 million different individuals in the Danish healthcare records. And this goes to the other aspect of the transformation here, which is the ability to measure many organisms at scale. And one such organism is humans, Humans are great organisms. We're slightly obsessed with them because we want to make humans as healthy as possible. But we're also very, very good at measuring humans. And we have a whole process called healthcare, which measures humans because of the way that they are either healthy or diseased. And we can leverage that measurement in these data sciences. Now, probably my two favorite data sets, and I'll put a third, which will be Estonia, is the Danish data set. Quite remarkably, you can get not just 5 million Danes that are alive, but 10 million Danes who have had their healthcare records since the 1990s. Now, you do have to do this on Danish computers, and you do have to do this vetted and approved by the appropriate ethical process in Denmark, which is done very carefully. But you can get access to it, and it is remarkable. The other data set, and I'm particularly proud of it because both my parents and in fact now myself are part of this, is the UK Biobank. This is 500,000 Brits, and they have been measured in great detail about 10 years ago, and they have been tracked going forwards over time, including their children. So including in some cases their children. So both my parents are in this data set, and in fact I am. And then there are many, many other great data sets, and I wouldn't be here without with Jaak here without mentioning how Estonia has placed its population data set at the heart of the way it thinks about doing research. And I want to give you one example about the research that we've done on this. And this goes back to one of Europe's first scientists, Leonardo da Vinci. And here are some sketches he made of probably human hearts, as well as bulls' hearts, cows' hearts. And he noted a very rough surface on the inside of the heart. And he thought that this was to do with heat. He thought it was to do with heat dissipation and cooling the heart. So this rough surface is shown now in a cutaway here on the left-hand side. It's called trabeculae. As you can see, the inside of the heart is really rather rough. And in the UK Biobank, 100,000 individuals have been measured at using the same MRI protocol in only 5 different centres across the UK. And what's being shown here on the right-hand side is the way that my colleague Declan O'Regan has transformed these MRI images into a way of quantifying this roughness on the inside of the heart. And he actually borrows a piece of mathematics that is used in geography and some other places called fractal dimension, And that's on the right-hand side. If you're used to this, this is a way of getting a sense of roughness through a really rather simple system. And I should have mentioned that to scale this up, although we actually only did it on 18,000 cases, which are the first 18,000 that were available, Declan uses deep learning to find the heart and discover where the inner blood flow is versus the surface is, and that's shown in panel C. And we do a very standard piece of genetics. I'm not actually going to talk you through this genetics. It's actually a very, very simple statistical model. As much of genetics is, the statistics is really rather simple. The sort of data science and the multiple testing problem are the places where you have to think a little bit harder in genetics. And we can find this is a classic picture of the genome, where the genome is lined up from chromosome 1 to chromosome 22 on the top, and then minus log 10 of the p-value of this statistic is shown going up. These are called Manhattan plots. And long experience has drawn a line at 5 times 10 to the minus 8, which is the gray line of significance, above which you can be pretty confident that you're seeing an association with that part of the genome with the phenotype that you look at. So many ways we have taken this, we wanted to take this piece of genetics one step further and understand better why this rough surface creates a particular surface. Sorry, there's a cat. Apologies. My cat wanted to come in. So why this rough surface was so important to hearts. And colleagues in Milano developed a model of the inside of the heart where they could vary in that model its smoothness or roughness. And the left-hand side shows the results of that model. This is a standard way cardiologist looks at how much pressure is in the heart versus the volume, the size of the heart. And this is effectively the size of this shape is how efficient the heart is, how much blood the heart can pump over time. And the model suggests that when the heart is rougher, it can pump better. And that's quite subtle. And the reason why is because of the fluid dynamics around the surface, around the heart blood fluid dynamics surface. But we can look at this model and compare that model to the way we observe this in the UK Biobank. That's the top left-hand side, but also use genetics here as a way of understanding the causal relationship between the roughness and, in this case, heart function and, in fact, heart disease. And this is now borrowing a piece of statistics from econometrics called instrument analysis. It's also called Mendelian randomization. So here again, we're using interdisciplinary techniques. We've taken a piece of statistical technique that's been developed in economics, and we've brought it into molecular biology. And that piece of molecular biology that we want to use is that the genetic variants we know, or we can convince ourselves, are randomly or pseudo-randomly distributed with respect to many, many other complicated aspects of human biology. And I will save you the complications about how we go about doing that, but trust me that that's a feasible thing to state. And once we know that these genetic variants are relatively unconfounded, we can use them as instruments in this statistical technique to ask whether the impact of the genetic variants on heart trabeculation is consistent with the impacts of the genetic variants on heart disease. And the plots in panel C and D here is showing that statistic. And what you should be focusing on are the meta-analysis, which are in purple, called weighted mode, weighted median, IVW, inverse variance weighted, and EGR. And if the bar is not crossing 0, so there's the estimate of the effect size from heart trabeculi to heart disease, that's the blob, and the bars is the confidence interval of that estimate. And if the confidence interval does not cross 0, then you can be confident that heart trabeculation is causally linked to heart disease, which is the case for panel C, which is a broad definition of heart disease. In panel D, we tried to push this on a very specific type of heart disease called dilated cardiomyopathy. And you can see that the meta-analysis is trending in the same way, but we cannot be as confident in this as the broad definition of heart disease on the top panel. This is one example of doing research, but I want to stress also that EMBL is not just here to do research. We want to enable all our member states, not the states where we have sites, but all 27 member states to take advantage of these developments. And I have a particular passion of trying to make sure that this is seized in the area of genomic medicine. So this is bringing genomics, the measuring of humans by biomolecular things, the genome, but also transcriptomes and proteomes and other things, into healthcare. But when we do that, it's a data science problem. The fundamental problem here is data science and statistics. And that's why we need colleagues like yourselves to come into this field, to infuse it with your wonderful computer science and statistics, and to work with us and with clinicians to deliver this. And I should stress here that in this area, it's very much about taking our ability and bringing it to countries. This will always be, because it's medicine, it must be run inside countries by people inside each country in this genomic medicine field. Looking ahead, we see even more importance of understanding biological systems, not just in this, what you might call data intensive way, but also in a theoretical way. And there's a number of ways where biology, there's non-trivial pieces of theory about how biological systems work, oscillators, phase space diagrams, other aspects where you see important changes which from first principles you expect to see, and then you can work out how to map that to experimental data. I want to touch a little bit on the pandemic. We have been working very, very hard to deliver both research and service on understanding this virus. And this goes from things like drug discovery. The middle thing here is an EM electron microscope being deployed to look at the SARS virus infecting cells, to also producing solutions to this horrible infection. But one of the most important things we've been doing has been delivering data. And so this is the SARS-CoV-2 data portal. We are the technical, this is a European project. There are many, many people behind this project, including the European Commission, the European Open Science Cloud, and the Elixir project. But EMBL, in particular EMBL EBI, is the technical centerpiece of the delivery of this portal. So basically, all these data sets flow through our databases, and in some sense, this is a COVID-specific portal onto our scaled-out infrastructure for this. So please go to the COVID-19 data portal. There is lots of open data for you to use in a variety of ways. And finally, we spend a lot of time also training. Now, one way we do training is simply by by having this 9-year rule and this turnover process. So in some sense, just our very existence trains many, many people in across EMBL, across Europe rather. But we also have dedicated training schemes for PhD students and for postdocs. And we have what you might think of as ongoing professional development training, external training, which includes a very comprehensive e-learning program. In the future, in the next 5 years, we would like to start a theory sabbatical program to enrich the ways we interact with theoreticians. And it's really important in the future, we also want to not just train traditional biomolecular scientists, but also inhabit this space of engineers. This is something that we feel physicists do well. They understand the need for what you might call scientific engineering in the area of high energy physics. And we need to do a similar thing in molecular biology. And that's engineering both for this technology development, for example, the clever EM microscopes, but also for software engineers and data scientists, where a lot of the problem is not necessarily the fancy statistics, it's getting the data flow right so you really get the scale of data you need to train these sometimes really rather simple models. So with that, I will end. I hope I haven't run over time, and thank you very much. I'm very happy to take questions.
No, you were not over time. You were actually a little bit ahead of time. But this is very, very good because we can open the floor for questions and discussion with the audience. Gregor, do you want to comment, or is this a comment in your chat box?
I don't know, can I speak? Do you hear me?
Yes, please.
Okay. Yeah, so I have written in my chat, thanks Ewan for this very interesting and highly informative talk. I'm software engineering, so I'm doing reliability, robustness, correctness, and all this stuff of algorithms. And I'm always a little bit afraid that in this data science community, people use algorithms and then they do not really check the correctness and the quality and so on, and then they derive results, and then they base decisions on these results. And so what can you do as a really important organization to take care of quality?
Yeah. So I think there are many different layers. So one thing's to say, firstly, Gregor, this is a very important area, as you've noted. And I think the other thing, and I'm sure you would agree this, is we need to think about this in depth. So there's not one solution to this problem. We need multiple layers to make these things very, very robust. One very, very simple thing is data sharing, an assumption of data sharing, an assumption that you must deposit your data. And the fundamental molecular biology community is really quite good at this. Much better than many other scientific fields. Basically, for things like protein structures and DNA sequence, you cannot publish if you don't deposit your data, which is a good thing. And then other people can pick the data up and reanalyze it and say, this is a bad thing. Actually, the other thing that happens is because you know that you are going to deposit your data, you have to be very honest about all the different we dropped data set X because of these reasons, so you can't hide anything in this, or you can hide less in this process. So people, I think it has a very good, transparency is a very good aspect to it. There is a complication about clinical data, which I'll come on to, which is really important to understand, because of course we cannot openly deposit data which is referring to humans without those humans having signed very, very careful consents. And in fact, so maybe I'll do it now. So there are some human data sets where the individuals have acknowledged that their data is going to be seen openly on the internet. But the ethical position for that is that the only thing we're allowed to know is that they are humans and they were healthy at some point in their lives. So that's the kind of criteria for fully open data. But there's a lot of data, for example, the UK Biobank, the Danish healthcare records, and other data sets where by definition, the data set is identifiable and has personal information to the individuals. And so you can't just spray that around the internet. And there, what you need to have is good access methods where different researchers can feel confident that they can apply for access to do research on those data sets and potentially check other people's work. And the UK Biobank is a great example of that. The Danish healthcare records are other good examples of that. We do have a bit of a cultural kind of headache sometimes with some of our clinical colleagues there, but that is softening as this world continues. But then what I think you'd be more interested in is some of the technical approaches to this. And the technical approaches goes to well-structured metadata. And the well-structured metadata, this collapses into ontologies and basically computable terms and vocabularies. And that's a very interesting and rich area of kind of knowledge management, where you allow yourself to express things in a rich enough way that matches the biology, but also can be computed over. And so you can start making statements such as, these two things are logically inconsistent when you see them together. And so you can do some reasonably sophisticated computing across entire data sets and flag things that either don't have enough terms for you to use them or look logically inconsistent. Now, most of the time what happens is that it's a mess, and what you do is you really exclude data sets. So what's incredibly hard to do is then fix it, right? So it's very, very hard to fix stuff, this. But what at least you can do is you can say these data sets have high quality information, and the information in these data sets are consistent with our understanding of the world. And so I'm going to use these data sets. And here's some other data sets which may be valid, but I can't work out what's going on with them. And so the tendency is to exclude them. And then if you give me one more thing, the final thing to say, and I go to here, I've learned a lot from epidemiologists, is to think about complementary ways of convincing yourselves and your skeptics that your understanding of the world is correct. So this is sometimes called triangulation. And rather than thinking about this problem as a reproducibility problem, so a lot of people think about this as a reproducibility problem and an accuracy problem, you think about it as, how can I get an orthogonal view on the same problem? And is the orthogonal view consistent with the view that I'm stating here? And I think that's actually very powerful, that orthogonal view perspective. And epidemiologists call this triangulation. And I've come to trust triangulation as the reason why why do you trust these results and not these results? It's because these results have been triangulated.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Enrico, you had a question on the software development as well. Enrico, are you on mute? Yes, you are.
Yes, sorry, always the same problem. This technology is not intelligent enough to understand when you are really speaking, where you're just making noise. Okay, so I read a few months ago a paper that shocked me because it told the history about regarding the code that was developed at the Imperial College to understand the spread of epidemics of COVID-19. Basically, the article said that the code was completely unintelligible, meaning that the quality of the code, was such that nobody could evaluate whether the code was wrong or right. So this is a classic software development process that we know very well in informatics. We have entire courses devoted to this. And I think this is something that it's a little bit whose importance is little bit underestimated outside our field. We train our students to document their software, to try to prove their software is correct, to write for maintainability of the software. While I can understand the reason, it often happens that in applied fields like biology or physics, they just write code and then go to the next generation or the next problem, write other code and write other code. And this means that sometimes, the code you have developed cannot be really checked. So I think it's needed to spread a little bit of this culture of software engineering also in other areas.
Yeah, I would agree, absolutely. And this is why we have this new ARISE fellowship towards engineers. And this is, I think it's very important to use the word engineers here and not scientists, because as you say, the engineering mindset is really somewhat different to the discovery mindset. The discovery mindset just wants to get there. The engineer wants to get there every day, yeah? The discovery mindset wants to cross the river once. The engineering mindset wants to build a bridge so that everybody can cross the river every day. Yeah. So I think that distinction is very important. A little bit back to Gregor's point, the example that you cite there, although it is old Fortran code, and it is very much Neil Ferguson's code, I don't think it's so awful. I actually had a look at it. I mean, it's, you know, it is science code. But the most important thing, Enrico, is that 3 other groups also did separate models, one of which is on GitHub and much, much nicer than the Imperial model. So there's a little bit of, in this specific case, this is a little bit of a kind of right-wing fantasy that it's all mysteriously badly done. Because there were 3 different groups, one of which really did comply much closer to your ideal software engineering practice. Now, Neil Ferguson's code was the one that was most cited, but personally, I think the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine code is the better code for this. And it should be stressed that these are scenarios, not forecasts. So in some sense, you know, you with an Excel spreadsheet could verify the basic logic of the scenario modeling for this. So I think that's an illustrative example. I mean, I do agree with your fundamental point, yeah, that we should value software engineering. Out of the 3 groups that contributed to that, Neil's had the least value to software engineering. It really was his personal code base. Whereas one of the 3 groups was much closer to your ideal, and of course doesn't make it into the papers saying, oh, very well done, nice piece of software engineering, thank you very much. And I wouldn't use this as the most major example for this. Actually, if we want to use this pandemic, the thing that really scared me a lot was that the UK data flow at one stage involved an Excel spreadsheet transform, and they ran out of columns. Yeah,
I know.
Yeah, and this was really bad. Yeah, yes. Don't do that. Yeah, so for me, that's an example where good risk analysis of the data flow would have said this is a critical thing. You know, we should replace this with urgency because we will hit a limit at that stage. So I have a lot of sympathy for these people who have to come up with real world solutions incredibly fast. But it goes to the fact that we have to value outside of a pandemic these processes so that we have robust systems for this. And you know, when one wants to start to do this in a pandemic, one sits on very, very solid foundations.
Yep.
I see several questions aiming towards gender and social aspects, but before going there, I would like to follow up a little bit on the computer science aspects. And Ewan, I know that you have been also thinking about data structures and fundamental algorithmic questions, especially in the context of DNA compression.
Yeah.
When we have really, really massive amounts of DNA, can you say something about what type of data structures are needed in there and deep computer science knowledge?
Yeah, so for me, this is a really great example of one of the interfaces between our 2 fields where we are generating huge amounts of data, as Jaak mentioned, on the human genome. Humans are very, very similar to each other. And so there's a huge amount of redundancy inherent in all of these data sets. However, there are, as well as differences, there are errors. So there are errors in the technical process of reading this. So when you get a data set that represents a human, it is kind of your basic human plus kind of actually 1 in 10,000 differences is what you expect to be biologically real, but then these errors in the measurement process. As Jaak said, it was great working out how to do compression better, and you immediately walk yourself into some classic pieces of computer science, which is arithmetic coding, data compression, and an awful lot of stuff that has worked out in video compression, for example. And there, I was really inspired by the way the computer scientists who have done compression have done this, and we just lifted a lot of this code and concepts into this biological domain. again, this kind of controlled loss of precision, which is a very common term in video compression, is very applicable to this error modeling problem in DNA sequence. I think that we need to do more of this. Proteomics is another place where we end up remeasuring the same thing again and again, and it's the thing that we measure is very similar between different human individuals. So we should be able to achieve compression in aggregate, but it's important that we model error in that. And then Jaak, if I should have probably added this to my talk rather than the research example I gave on the heart. It's stupid of me not to do my storing information in DNA. So this is going in the opposite direction. This is where we think of DNA as a digital media system. So here, DNA, you might think of it as a biological storage system, but we can write DNA to our own design. And so rather than writing information to a hard drive, we can write information to DNA fragments. Now, it ends up being the properties of DNA are you know, it's like a different channel. It's a different Shannon channel with different properties. And it's a very, very good fit to fountain codes. So again, I learned about fountain codes. I didn't know about fountain codes 10 years ago, and now know a lot more about fountain codes. And if there's anybody in computer science here, we have a really true insertion deletion problem in DNA coding. So these are not erasure codes. So we have an insertion deletion problem, which is traditionally not very well handled in most traditional compression error correcting codes. So I think there's a real rich space about understanding how one thinks about insertion deletion processes and error correcting codes and fountain codes all in one big thing. But DNA is a remarkable storage system. My little finger could store an exabyte of information if it was all DNA. And of course, getting information out of it would be virtually impossible at speed, but the storage density is remarkable. And you need no electricity to keep DNA. It just needs to be dry, basically. And the easiest way, by the way, to keep DNA dry is to keep it cold. So that's why DNA lasts so long in freezers. It's not really that it needs to be cold. It needs to be 100% dry. If it's 100% dry, it will not change. And the oldest piece of DNA that we have sequenced comes from a dead horse in Siberia. It's 750,000 years old. Now, just to put that timescale into context, that is before the emergence of humans as a species. So it's before we anatomical humans emerged as a species. So we could write into a medium that lasted longer than we do, or longer than we have been around. So I just want to dangle that in front of you. And there was a really nice paper by my colleague Robert Grace from Switzerland on this. And again, shows this sort of two-way world of information in DNA. It's very, very linked.
Okay, I see the questions more now. If we start to wrap up, then I see the question about gender and social aspects in this health data analysis and genomic data analysis. Maybe you can touch up on the genetics and health and social aspects. Yeah,
so I think it's a very important aspect. There's a couple of different things. So the first thing to acknowledge is that research has been in, like many areas, but it's been default male for a very, very long time. Now, in biology, we focus quite carefully on the distinction between sex, which is effectively the chromosomal content that you're born with, and gender, which is the gender that you decide that you have. They are similar thing, or they're related things. They're very related things, but they are distinct. So there's a distinction here between kind of analysis by chromosomal content, by sex, versus analysis by gender. But biomedical research has had a default male perspective for a very long time. Now this is changing a lot, and my student, one of my students, has an absolute passion for kind of getting stuck in there. But there's still a lot of things we need to do. I have to admit, there's a lot of biology where you can just model sex as a covariate and it works out fine. So humans, as in the phrase of biologists, we are sexually dimorphic. There are things which are different by chromosomal content, but it's not much. I'll contrast that to spiders and some other species where the sexual dimorphism is huge, so big that you have to analyze the two sexes separately, otherwise it's nuts. So that's not the case for humans. For humans, very often you can use just a kind of covariate. You can model the sex difference. But then this interacts with the other topic here, which is the way society is structured. So a lot of health stuff is about the way society is structured. From some perspective, we create environments for the rest of us to live in. We call that society. And that's really, really important in health. And a really simple thing is like, when do you go to the doctor? What reasons do you go to the doctor for, and stuff like that. This depends a lot about your position in society, your access to healthcare, your gender, and then these other things such as ethnicity and other aspects of it. So these societal factors have a very, very big impact on health. And in fact, when you start looking at health variables, you cannot avoid kind of understanding them and modeling them and using them. And it's a bit depressing actually when you get into it, because it becomes very, very stark how much we discriminate in society. I would say that here, ethnicity, which many people think is almost more biological than sex, is actually very, very much a social construct. We have just dreamt it up. We have just decided that dark-skinned people should be classified differently from white-skinned people. Humans are a very undiverse genetic species. Most of the diversity we have is in sub-Saharan Africa. And when you look at our genetics and our biology, we still look like a very small bunch of apes from Africa, which is what we are. We are a very small group of apes from Africa. And I know that this doesn't correspond to people's societal view, because from Africa, it sounds like where you live. Low diversity doesn't seem to match to our very high cultural diversity, but our biological diversity is very, very low. And so ethnicity, I have a real passion. If you go on the internet and you Google me and you read my blogs, you can see that I have a passion about untangling ethnicity, which is predominantly a social process where we have decided to label certain people in certain ways from biology. So just to make this very clear, we could have decided that all the red-headed people in the world were in a separate group. And every time you met a red-headed person, you'd say, oh, which part of Ireland are you from? And, you know, are you very, very angry, or attributed all these things to that. Now, we don't do that because that seems completely silly. It is exactly the same thing for skin color, basically. And we don't realize that. We have just decided to structure our society in a particular way. So I have a real passion about untangling or removing this concept of biological essentialism from our view of ethnicity. And please read my blogs for more information.
Okay, I think I take one more question about, and this is about the legal aspects of data sharing. Do you think that in Europe we need to change something? Okay, yeah. Europe without Britain is sad Europe, but what do you think on the legal aspects of data sharing?
So Britain is still part of Europe. We're just not going to be part of the European Union. And I should have mentioned that the UK will still be part of the European Molecular Biology Laboratory and the part of CERN. So I'm British and I'm a very proud European. I'm a proud Brit and I'm a proud European. So please let's not lose the word European and British for me. But to go to that point, this goes globally to the Global Alliance for Genomics of Health, which I'm chair of. And then in a European perspective, including the UK, it goes to GDPR provisions. So just to talk about the global perspective, this is a recognized problem globally, and there are kind of some level of solution to it, and those solutions are improving. What doesn't happen here, by the way, is that there's a kind of UN thing, that it's one legal system for everybody. It just doesn't work that way. But every country has signed up to the UN Declaration of Human Rights. And in those human rights is the right to participate in science and the right to benefit from science. And every country, or nearly every country, has signed those human rights. So those human rights are part of every single country's national legislation. And the Global Alliance aims to activate those human rights to allow people to participate in science, that is, in other words, to be research subjects, and to benefit from science, that is, access to research. And then you do that in a framework that has reciprocity and very, very careful views about risk and of harm to the participants. This is less worrying, or it's as worrying as sharing credit card information. We should be more concerned about sharing credit card information than we are concerned about sharing genomes, but because genomes seem more essential than credit cards, and credit cards have lots and lots of everyday value, people, it's all inverted the wrong way out. But going to the legal framework, GDPR has a slot called best practice or community practice. I can't quite remember what it's called, best practices domains, research domains. And in GA4GH, the Global Alliance for Genomics in Health, there is the European subset, which is working very much with Elixia's human project to have a GDPR compatible way of talking about this. Now, again, we've been doing this for a very long time, for 20 years. So in some sense, this is sort of updating current practice to fit cleanly inside of GDPR, and for GDPR to go through the process of recognizing it. But there's no doubt that GDPR has created a kind of new framework and a new set of lawyers and a new set of scrutiny on this process. And I think we should welcome that. I think that's a good thing, not a bad thing, to have that scrutiny. But the overall goal to share data responsibly to enable good research is a common goal shared by many, many governments, many, many citizens, and many, many researchers. And we should make sure that we are able to continue to do that in the future. Sorry, that was a bit of preachy.
But thank you very much, Ewan. We have to close the session. So I think this was a wonderful session and really broad view on the interdisciplinary science. I think the plan now was to have a short break, and then we will continue with the next speaker on more on the gender aspects. So let's give an applause to Ewan, virtual one. Thank you, well done.
And my pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Hope that you can hang on for the next presentation as well. But
okay, perfect, will do.
Please, Letizia, you want to say something about the next session?
Yes, if Svetlana could share the slide, I could introduce. I
think we will start in 10 minutes, right? So we have a 10-minute break.
Yes, but then we can. I don't need to say much. I hope that you will come back, and we will have an interesting talk about Professor Vivian Lagesen about gender and computer science. So please come back, and I will present Professor Lagesen when we come back, and have a nice coffee. And thank you very much to Ewan. It was really very, very inspiring. Thank you. I don't need to repeat what is online. I think that especially now in digital time, in Zoom time, we have to try to be as human as possible, so not copy what is on the internet from before. I would like to say 2 words about my relation to Vivian. I learned a lot from you, Vivian. What I know about gender from a scientific point of view, it's because I learned from you. And you helped us a lot to set up the Eden project that is becoming almost a reference point in Europe now for doing gender action from PhD to professor level. So my introduction to you is more a thank to you. And I'm looking forward to hear your speech, even if I know most of what you are going to say, and I really hope that you will inspire the community as you have done with me in the last year. So the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Letizia, and thank you so much for inviting me for the conference. It's a great pleasure to be here and talk about a topic that has been frequently discussed over the years, but still persistently remains to be a problem, namely the underrepresentation of women in informatics. And my talk will address how we may work to improve gender diversity in ICT or informatics. And thank you also to Ewan for a very interesting talk on biology. And it was interesting how you said that ethnicity is a cultural construct, not a biological construct. Because in my talk, I will also address how gender, not biology, but gender, are also very much a social and cultural construct, at least in relation to ICT. Now, the concern for this digital gender gap started in the mid-1990s when the number of women dropped significantly all over the Western world, and perhaps most prominently in the Northern and Western Europe. And as you see from these figures, there are some variation between countries in Europe, and there are even larger variations worldwide, which I will come back to in this talk. However, overall, as the numbers show, the digital gender gap in informatics is very real still. So why is this a problem? Well, the digital gender gap has caused three main concerns. There has been an economic concern, and the European Commission has estimated that the annual productivity loss for the European economy for the digital gender gap is about 16.2 billion euro. It has caused a scientific concern, meaning that the lack of women reduces the pool to harvest talents from, and research has also shown that the lack of diversity reduces the chances of innovative scientific outcomes. And last but not least, there is a political concern where the digital gender gap contributes to legitimize and support the hierarchical relations of men and women in society at large. And embedded in this, we may also ask, what consequences does it have that women's experiences are not reflected in the development of new information and communication technologies? So this has been a puzzle, and I often illustrate this puzzle with a quote from Dame Wendy Hall that I saw was talking here yesterday. We met at a workshop in 2004 at the Oxford Internet Institute, and she stated, I remember very well in her keynote, that it is easier to put man on the moon than to get women to enter the computer profession. And I often use that quote to illustrate the vast amount of effort and resources that has been put down to get more women into ICT, even if I doubt that it's the same amount of resources that was used to put man on the moon, certainly. But this is not easy. However, my plan for today is certainly not to be gloomy about this. On the contrary, I will share with you some lessons learned about important things to consider when designing for inclusion strategies. So to be pedagogical, my talk will concentrate on five what I will call generic lessons, arguing what are important things to consider when designing for inclusion measures. And this is not a recipe of how to do it, but it represents some important insights from research that should be reflected when making inclusion strategies. And the five lessons I will argue, elaborate, and transubstantiate in this talk are: inclusion strategies should be based on inclusion thinking rather than exclusion thinking. Inclusion measures should aim to create positive circles of inclusion, and I will talk about what that is. Quantity and quality are important inclusion instruments. Gender stereotyping is a pitfall and should be avoided. And gender balance and gender balance measure benefits everyone, men as well as women. So these lessons draw upon several research projects. One project is a comprehensive EU study that aimed to identify successful inclusion strategies of women into the information society, and it consisted of 48 case studies across 5 European countries. Secondly, a comparative study of women students and faculty in informatics in Norway and Malaysia. Third, a study of men and women in ICT companies in Silicon Valley, Malaysia, and Norway. And fourth, several studies of inclusion initiatives at my own university, the NTNU, including a longitudinal study assessing the effect of these measures. And I also draw upon research literature on other inclusion initiatives that has taken place in informatics. So before I continue, I will briefly define what I mean by inclusion strategies. It's in this context, a fairly broad meaning. Activities aim to recruit people into and or retain and socialize them within some system. So how may we best design for better inclusion? The first lesson is that inclusion strategies should be based on inclusion thinking rather than exclusion thinking. Now, why is that? What does that mean? Well, if we consider most research in this area on women in ICT, it has been concerned with what it is that exclude women from computer science. And these titles are just a few examples of how women have experienced being in computer science. These are quite recent books. These are books by Emily Chang called Brotopia, Breaking Up the Boys Club of Silicon Valley. And then there's been a very influential article by Lisa Mundy saying, why is Silicon Valley so awful to women? And then there's the book from Margolis and Fisher from 2002 about a project in Carnegie Mellon. But what's interesting here is the titles, you know, what it signifies or signals. It has been a tale of an unwelcoming and chilly cultures for women and other minorities. And there has been frequent observations of sexism, sexual harassment, ridicule, etc. This also goes for other ICT-related areas such as gaming and the ICT industry, as we see here. So another observation of the literature in this field is the widespread use of so-called deficit models as the main mode of explanation of why there are so few women. And such deficit models have been women's deficits, the claim that women lack knowledge, experience, interest, self-confidence, playfulness, etc. with regard to ICT. There's also been a lot of focus on the deficits in the educational practices of computer science and also deficits in the culture and image of computer science. And one very famous example of that is Joseph Weizenbaum's description of computer science students at MIT in 1976, where he described them as bright young men of disheveled appearance, often with sunken, glowing eyes, their unwashed and unshaven faces, and their uncombed hair. All testify that they are oblivious to their bodies and to the world in which they move. And this is certainly not an attractive image there. But this culture and this image of the hacker have been seen as a reason in the literature why women opt out or feel alienated in higher education, ICT, and industry. So to sum up, research literature has been permeated by an understanding of women to have a non-relationship or a negative relationship to computer science. And the narrative of women in ICT has been one of barriers predominantly, which has led to what we may designate as a negative circle of exclusion. Now, the problem with the exclusion narrative is not that such observations are necessarily wrong, but rather that they are insufficient and counterproductive when it comes to getting women included. Because if we are going to use this knowledge to create inclusion, that would mean to remove the phenomena that produce the exclusion, like cultures, norms, ideologies, practices, networks, etc. And that is not so easy. So the point is that inclusion efforts must involve attractions. So we need more knowledge about how women become included to computer science, when they are included, and what mechanism and processes that is at work then as a basis to build inclusion measures on. Now, if you look at the same story only instead of with the perspective on men, we see that the story becomes very different, because these notions from the previous slide about the brotopia of the brotherhood, the boys club, the clubhouse, etc., signify a strong message of inclusion, or to be more precise, inclusion of someone who fits that image. So in both research literature and in fiction, men has been portrayed as having a close relationship to technology. Men has been described as having a playful approach and a deep fascination, even love for computers. And it's not a coincidence that images like this is easy to find on the internet. And these are some of the books that has been written that sort of also see or treat technology as an important role in shaping masculine identities and as tools for bonding and forming relations between men. So what we see is a positive symbolic link between men and ICT, as well as a culture permeated by gendered norms and ideologies that together constitute what we may call a positive circle of inclusion of men to ICT. Now, these circles of inclusion and exclusion described here is at least partly explaining why this is so difficult to change, because they denote very powerful dynamics. There are many things that build upon each other and pulls in the same direction. And clearly it produces extremely stereotyped images of both men and women. So, however, it is important to realize that these phenomena are social and cultural constructions. Therefore, it doesn't have to be this way. It could be otherwise, and actually it is otherwise, and a good example of that is the case of Malaysia. Now, in the following, I will use the case of Malaysia as an example of how socially and culturally constructed gender diversity is. And what is interesting about Malaysia is that women represent the majority of ICT in public university and also a substantial share of the ICT workforce. Here are some figures from the Faculty of Computer Science and Information Technology at the University of Malaya, which is the oldest public university in Malaysia, located in Kuala Lumpur. And as we can see from the figures, there's an even gender balance in computer science and actually a slight overrepresentation of women in the IT program. Also, interestingly about this faculty was that most of the professors were women, all the heads of departments were women, and the dean was a woman. Now, these figures are a bit old, but I did some research just to verify that this is actually still the case in Malaysia. In public universities. So, what was it that attracted so many young women to computer science in Malaysia? This was what I was investigating when I was there, and I interviewed women, students, and faculty about this. And many of the women students and staff talked about a long-standing enthusiasm and fascination with computers, stemming all the way back to primary school, like in this quote by Selena. Now, I won't read this quote I'm going to show you. I'm just going to give you time to read them yourself and talk about them. Actually, many of the women students had become interested in computer science when they were in primary or secondary school. Many of them had joined so-called computer clubs that the government initiated in the middle of the 1980s. And since Malaysia has a tradition for women teachers, many talked about how their teachers had been important role models and how it had made them interested in also becoming computer science teachers. So they had important role models. Another argument was that ICT had very good career prospects, which is recognizable, I would assume, in most countries. But in Malaysia, it was regarded as a particularly sensible choice for a young woman because it was important to make sure to have a job career before they got married. So this was one of the arguments put forward by the study of computer science. Also in Malaysia, parents exercise a lot of authority when it comes to the choice of education. And many talked about how they were being encouraged by the parent, or as in this case, brainwashed by the parents to choose computer science. And there is a tradition for actually listening to parents' advices in Malaysia, perhaps as opposed to in many other countries. One of the reasons that parents were so eager to make their daughters study computer science in the first place was the fact that the Malaysian government had been urging young people to study ICT for years. Malaysia, being a very inspired by its neighbor country of Singapore, has an explicit strategy of making ICT the main inroad to the information society, and in that way leapfrog into becoming a highly developed country. So the fact that the government urged young people to study ICT also made parents encourage and influence their daughters to study ICT. And lastly, because this was a woman-dominated subject, or looked upon as a woman-dominated subject, ICT was very much constructed as a particularly good place to be for women. It was perceived as representing indoor work, and in that way it was considered safe and not exposed. Other women mentioned that it also represented an opportunity to work from home, which meant it was suitable and convenient to combine with having a family, which was also an important point. So you see, the fact that there was so many women in computer science also made them constructed into a field or discipline that was also very suited for women. And particularly interesting in this context is that the women were considered particularly good in programming. And they were also seen as particularly suited for programming. And the explanation was that programming required patience, it required hard work, it required being detail-oriented, etc. And these were qualities that was attributed more to Malay women than to men. So the point is that such gendered notions are very cultural constructions. And I also loves to show this quote because it shows in a way how differently computers can be constructed. For this young bachelor student, she talked about how it was her mother that was mainly using the computer for fun and playing computer games. And she sort of categorized it as a typical indoor activity together, like making cakes, bakings, etc. While her dad, on the other hand, was not interested in computers at all, because he only used it when he needed to use it, when he was a teacher, printing out exam papers, etc. But he would never touch the computer apart from that. So the fun way of using computers, that was the way her mother was using the computer. So it sort of shows how this can be totally turned on its head, these sort of ideas and associations we have about who uses the computer and for what. The point here is that there is a positive circle of inclusion that sustain a high share of women in computer science in Malaysia. So the concept of a positive circle is a generic one. What happened in Malaysia is not an outcome of any conscious policy to recruit women at all, but we see how several elements work together and pulls in the same direction in a manner that sustains this high number of women. However, I would also emphasize that it's important to note that the high proportion of women is the main reason why this construction of ICT as a woman-friendly and a good choice for women are made in the first place. Obviously, it was a way for my interviewees to make sense and meaning to the situation, which was that many women was choosing computer science. So such constructions are also very part of meaning-making processes that we do as individuals in society. So my argument is that gender balance produces a different and less gendered culture. In Malaysia, it was perceived as a woman-friendly place, and the previously notions of hackers or geeks that are so dominant in the Western culture were not there at all. It was, on the contrary, considered as taken for granted that women was as interested and good in computer science that men were. And it made ICT a better place and more attractive for both men and women to be in. So that brings me to the second lesson, which is that inclusion measures should aim to create positive circles of inclusion. Now, how can we use this knowledge to address the situation in the Western world, so to speak? How can we attempt to make positive circles of inclusion to ICT? One of the findings from the CIGIS projects across all these case studies made was that the initiatives that managed to address what we call inclusion needs had a higher probability of creating positive circles of inclusion. And the most important inclusion needs were access, motivation, and capability. So I will give some examples of how this could be done, drawing on research done on 2 successful inclusion initiatives of including women to higher education in computer science. One took place in the US at the Carnegie Mellon University, where they improved the number of women in computer science from 7 to 42%. And the second project took place at my own university, the NTNU, and managed also to raise the number of women from 6 to 39% in 1 year. And how did they do that? First, we should note that both these successful projects employed a range of different measures at the same time. So this increased the possibility to address several of the inclusion needs, which allowed this project to gain a certain momentum. Now, I will only focus on some of these measures here to make the points I want to make. And both had in common that they took steps to increase the access to the program and thereby create an influx of women, either by changing admission criteria, as they did in Carnegie Mellon, or making a quota for women, which they did at NTNU. So these were quite radical steps, but they worked. Also, the measures on the outreach activities that these projects had created what we have called an important Hawthorne effect, a raised attention and awareness about the fact that the university wanted more women students. And this was perceived by the women applicant as an invitation. And it was also a way to signal that women were highly wanted in the program. And creating this quota for women in the NTNU project was part of underlining or stressing the seriousness of that invitation. This led in both projects to a critical mass of women in the program, which in turn had some important effects. It contributed to creating a peer-supported community among women. The gender mix also created a better culture also for men. And this became evident in the longitudinal study we did when we found that an improved gender balance statistically reduced the probability of dropout among men students. So for every 10% increase in the share of women, the probability of dropout among men students shrunk with about 3.5% during a period of 10 years. And importantly also, it influenced the symbolic interpretation of computer science to become less masculine. At least it did so internally. But as we saw in Malaysia, it can also be done on a societal level, because when the proportion of women gets so high, it ceases to become or perceived as a masculine, particularly masculine discipline or field. We also found that improving quality was an important instrument to address the inclusion needs of motivation, capability, and empowerment. And this included measures like improving the educational quality, like better and more inspiring teachers, etc. It could also be tailoring the courses to address a more diverse student population. And it also included providing introductory courses and hand-on workshops to the first-year students. So tailoring the content of ICT is both an instrument to address access, because it makes it possible to recruit more students, more diverse students into ICT, and but it's also a way to prevent dropout by improving quality. Finally, the strategy of improving quality is also one that benefits all students, but it particularly benefits student groups that is on the margins. That is what research has shown. So to sum up, lesson 3, quantity and quality are important inclusion instruments. So we see that quantity, also the sheer numbers, have several functions. It is, of course, how we measure the outcome of an initiative to deem if it's successful or not. Secondly, it reduces the disadvantages of being a minority, which is very well documented by research on minorities. Third, and mentioned, gender balance increases the well-being of both men and women students. But perhaps most importantly, it contributes to degender the symbolic property of the field, which makes it easier to recruit and retain women, as we saw in Malaysia. Now, improving quality may be a point of departure for developing inclusion strategies. A good example of this was one of the case studies we did in the SIGIS study, which was a case study about computer game producers. Because there was a computer game producer who wanted to create a market for computer games for girls. They didn't have that market already. So they decided to try and make games that they thought would interest girls, and they ended up making a Pocahontas game, Pocahontas from Disney. But it flopped, and they could not understand why. However, what they figured out was that other games that did attract women players were the games that women thought had the best stories in them. And these were also the games that attracted most of the boy players. So girl players was not interested in Pocahontas, but in playing the best games with the best stories, with the best graphics, etc. Exactly in the same way as all the other players were. So this is an important lesson to see that enhancing quality is a better strategy than relying on gender stereotypes. And I will continue a bit with gender stereotypes on that argument, because similar to the Pocahontas computer game, the NTNU project in the beginning also relied on gender stereotypes when they were making advertising campaigns to recruit women to computer science. And this is one example from one of their brochures, saying that women make circles and men make squares. The university wants more computer science students that make circles. So this was the message. And it was followed up by these pictures and with the text, who do you think will get the job of making a system that makes everyday life easier for patients and doctors? And obviously, the rhetorical question here points to how women are better at communicating and how men are predominantly concerned with the technical issues and what is best in the patient-doctor relationship. So it was, and there are some temptations in using such arguments to attract an underrepresented group, like in this case, trying to redefine computer science to be about communication rather than technology or technical issues. So it's not stupid in a way, but it's a very risky strategy. Clearly, ICT is both about communication and technology. But it's better to have a strategy that attracts a diverse body as possible, rather than rely on narrow stereotypes. Because we interviewed the women that were subjected to these campaigns, and they did not appreciate the content because it was targeted far too narrow. Because these were women with a diversity of interest. Communication, yes, but also very technically interested women that was sort of put off by this kind of advertising campaigns and actually discouraged them from applying. So lesson 4, avoid gender stereotypes. Because it does not work well, it targets too narrow, but there are also other important reasons not to use them, and that is for political and long-term reason. It contributes to conserve gender stereotypes rather than transgressing them. So better alternatives is to construct for a wider diversity than gender. And in general, nobody wants to be a stereotype or recognize themselves in a stereotype. So knowledge is an important antidote to stereotyping. I think I've used my time. Now I have come to the end, and hopefully I argued that inclusion measures and gender balance benefit both men and women in ICT throughout this talk. And I ended with a cheerful note from the University of Malaya that I just found. And yeah, with that I will just say thank you. Shall I stop sharing, perhaps?
No, it's okay. I would like to give the words. We have 2 questions in the chat. The first is by Jean-Marc, and the second by Pekka in Finland. And I would like Jean-Marc to unmute, if possible, and to ask his question himself. If not, I will read it, the question from the chat.
I think I can do it. Do you hear me?
Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very, very much for this very, very interesting talk. So my remark, I'm a newcomer to this field somehow. So please forgive me of my naive kind of question. I mean, I do not know nothing, so that's the point. But I was a bit uncomfortable with this example from Malaysia because it replaced one stereotype, the one we have in Europe, let's say, that computers are for guys and not for women, by another stereotype. And so I thought that it was a bit weird that they still use stereotypes such as, I mean, to simplify, the women are inside homes and the men are outside. And so they replace one stereotype by another one, but they do not solve the problem. But I've seen that in the end of your talk, you also say that it was important to deconstruct all stereotypes together. So, but I think this Malaysian example is a bit weird somehow because of that.
Vivian, before you go ahead, if it's possible that you remove the sharing of your screen, because then the one who talk, yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much. So when you talk, we will see you in full screen. Thank you.
Yeah. Shall I reply to that now, or I can do that? Yeah,
I think it's okay now.
Thank you, Jean-Marc. It's a very good question, not naive at all, and I certainly agree. Yeah. Now, you could say that. Well, I definitely agree with you. One should not replace one gender type with another, and the main point is, of course, to dismantle all kinds of gender stereotypes. So in Malaysia, it gives a slightly wrong image when I pull out these kind of quotes, because I think that in actually why they were sort of trying to find ways of explaining why there were so many women in computer science to me when I asked about it. I don't think really that this was something that they had thought a lot about. So most of the people were quite puzzled when I asked about gender in this context, because what on earth did gender have to do with computer science? You know, that was the main reaction I got, that, well, there's nothing gendered about computer. I don't, you know, they didn't understand the research topic at all, because they were not familiar with how the situation was in the Western country, and they were quite surprised to hear about it. That was totally new to many of them, and they couldn't understand why this would be so. And I have some other quotes that show their sort of puzzlement, and they're trying to find, well, why? You know, is it because of the parents? You know, they try to ask me about what are the reasons for this, and of course is so yeah, definitely you're right. And so, but in this situation that you are sort of interviewing people about a fact or something that they look around and they have to come up with some answer, so to speak. And so they were sort of making up why this is a suitable thing for women. But that doesn't take away the fact that it was looked upon as a very suitable place for women to be, even if there wasn't particular reasons for it, because it was a very natural choice for women, because there were women there already. Lots of women were studying computer science, so it was a very, common sense choice to make. So that is my point about the importance of gender balance. When it becomes like that, it's not longer these gendered barriers in a way. It becomes a very natural choice, so to speak, or an easy choice.
Thank you very much, Vivian. I think we go to the second question that is by Professor Pekka from the University of Aalto in Finland. If you can unmute, Pekka.
Yes, I'm unmuted. Yeah, so I want to ask about this phenomenon that I've observed personally, and also she mentioned that actually there seem to be more women in engineering and general computer science, particularly in lower income countries, maybe because it's a good career opportunity there, and it's available for women, and it's a good career, so that that makes it a more attractive choice in such a setting. I wonder if this correlation exists and how strong it is.
Well, no, I'm not an expert on the career opportunities in ICT, but I would assume that they are considered to be good in most countries. They're definitely so in Norway. It's so. I think that is more of a. I don't think that is so very different between countries or context. That this is obviously a place with very good career options. So there are clearly other things that sort of are reasons why, for instance, so few Norwegian women choose computer science, or German women, or there are interesting variations between countries. And we know that, for instance, in Southern Europe, there has been more women in informatics and also in mathematics and in science subjects than in the northern part of Europe. The US has a slightly higher proportion of women, but interesting is mainly Americans with Asian ethnicities that are dominating in the US when it comes to women in computer science. So there are many culturally aspects clearly that sort of influences how young men and women choose their discipline and study. So yeah.
I was asking because your data seem to suggest this kind of correlation without kind of understanding what might be the reason. The correlation seemed to be there. I don't know if this is real or just a kind of an artifact in the data. Okay, well, anyway, thanks. Yes.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Pekka.
thank you.
So then we have Enrico and Linda have a quite similar question about the differences inside computer science. Maybe I give the word to Linda, who
Okay. Sorry, Enrico. So I notice in certainly the Netherlands, I don't know if it's across Europe, that some subfields like security or databases have almost zero women, whereas the more psychologically based fields like HCI have a lot more women. And I feel this is a problem. Is this a problem?
You ask me?
Yes.
Well, I definitely think it's a problem. I think it's really important. Yeah.
So why do these different fields have these different natural tendencies to this gender stereotype?
That's interesting question. And before I continue, I just want to say that this is not just a phenomenon within ICT. This is very much a phenomena in most disciplines. It is in mathematics, it is in medicine, it is in political science, etc. There seems to be some clusters of men and women, or they divide differently on different topics. There might be some reasons why this became So in the first place, that has to do with how you are sort of associating or what you are interested in, etc. But I think an important point is that there seems to be a tendency that women go over there are other women, and men divide perhaps more equally on many different subjects. But I also think that has to do with men traditionally being a majority and a sort of, it's, you know, because men does not go that much to nursing, for instance, or health science, etc. And now then doesn't even go to medicine or psychology. So I think that is why gender balance is so important, because it's sort of, so trying to find a word, it sort of neutralizes this drive. It is that thing that there are these gendered clustered, you know. So when there is like that, it's difficult to be a minority, and even if it's in a small research group, you know, being the only woman or being the only man in a research group is not, you know, it's not. It's better to have a gender balance, because it makes it sort of less gendered, and it's also, it gives a better social environment. That is what we see from research, at least, that both men and women appreciate a better gender balance.
I think we have time to give the word to Enrico as well, and then to Jaak, and then I don't see several questions in the chat. Okay, maybe we will manage the question by Visa as well, but let's give the word to Enrico, and let's see how much time. Yeah, go ahead, Enrico.
Okay, thanks, Letizia. I'll make it short. So congratulations for your nice talk, and I fully agree with you that we need to have more balance in informatics. But I would like you to ask to elaborate a little bit on what you said in answering to Linda about the fact that in life sciences we have a gender unbalance in favor of women. So do you see this as a normal or something to work on? And my provocative question, maybe there is some natural tendency of women and men to choose a certain field. Shouldn't we focus more on equality of opportunity more than equality of outcomes? Because it may happen that I like to play soccer and you like to play cards, but it is important that you should be able to play soccer if you like, and I should be able to play cards if I like. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much. So to start with the last question, I would say that yes, of course, it's important to be able to choose whatever you like to choose, but it is more difficult to choose what you like to choose if you're a woman and it's very man-dominated, because then you have to sort of face being sort of also you become sort of a token, you know, you become a minority, and it's difficult to be a minority even if you're a man in a woman-dominated field and a woman in a man-dominated field. So the gender imbalance actually hinders free choices in a way, because it's not that easy to choose just out of interest, because it becomes an issue that you become a very underrepresented group. So that was so that it's the idea of free choices is very based on an individual perspective, is very tempting and optimistic, but in reality it's not free choices when you have such gender imbalanced environments. That was one. Oh, sorry, what was the, yeah, and yes, I do believe it's a problem that some fields also become women dominated. And what we are seeing on statistics is that it's actually a tendency to focus on aggregated numbers. And if you look at the aggregated numbers, the number of women professors in academia, for instance, throughout Europe or in any countries, are increasing, and that looks really nice because it seems that it becomes more and more gender balanced. But if we go down and look at the different disciplines, we see that actually more and more disciplines are coming more gender imbalance. So the fact that more disciplines are now becoming women dominated sort of makes it look as if the whole of academia are coming more gender balanced, but it doesn't solve the problem that the man-dominated fields remains so man-dominated, while some fields are evolving to become women-dominated. So it's actually a gender segregation that is taking place rather than an improved gender balance, you know. So both needs to be worked on, definitely.
Thank you, Vivian. There are a lot of interesting questions. We have the question by Jaak that has also been commented by Christina. So Jaak, if you could read your question.
Yes. So I got into heated social media debate. Recently, we have some initiatives that are aiming at girls, sort of like to compensate for the when the young boys at schools get into robotics classes, then there are very few girls around, and because of the imbalance, they sort of are getting kicked out. And then to counterbalance that, there are private initiatives that have created these girls-only events. Digi Girls, Tech Sisters, one of these HK, Unicorn Squad in Estonia. And then the question is, does this kind of create different kind of problems, that if you do only the girls targeted events, like it was pointed out, that maybe it's almost as if they are weaker sex in that concern, or some technical compensations. What are the negative aspects or positive aspects for these girls only events? Can you comment on that? Yes, no, that is definitely an issue that is often debated, you know. Does it make, is it a, what do you call it, Norwegian Birney? Is it to make these women sort of a disfavor, to give them privileges in a way, or what is considered to be privileges, because then they perhaps are seen as not good enough, you know, because they are even like coming in on a quota, or they are sort of getting privileges that makes them subject to sort of, I don't know, jealousy. It becomes something particular. So, well, what we saw in the NTNU initiative, where they made a quota for women, it was that it caused a lot of debates. There was this fear that women would become sort of a B team, the women that had come in on that quota. In reality, all the students that was admitted, including the women students in the quota, was very highly qualified students. They had a very high points. So that wasn't really a concern in a real sense, if you know what I mean. They were highly qualified women, but they were afraid of being looked upon as a B team, and sometimes they would hear comments about it. But when we weigh that up against the advantage it was to get such a critical mass of women in the first place, that had other effects, that sort of was able to sort of sustain to get more women, to the recruitment of women, you need to sort of balance those against each other, because if you use radical steps, you can achieve a difference that can have some sort of effects that will sort of build upon that. And that is the positive circle that I'm talking about. You can initiate sort of a positive circle. It's easier to get more women to apply if there are women there in the first place, etc. But of course, you need to face those sort of allegations or controversies that it may cause, but that needs to be also handled in best possible ways by sort of showing that these are qualified women, and sort of dismissing those kind of arguments, and say that, well, in this case, gender balance is actually so important for so many reasons that we choose to do it this way.
So I would like to, there are many interesting points that come now. There is this question by Professor Ivica, the question by Christina, the comment by Letizia Tanka. I think since it's 12 o'clock, if you could read the chat, Vivian, and just give some final words about these questions. While you read, I can remind you that tomorrow afternoon we will have a workshop that Erika Abramson and I will lead, that is exactly about the issues that we are discussing now. Ivica will be one of the session leader. So I think I will not give the word to you, Ivica. We will talk all the whole afternoon tomorrow. I really would love that the people in this discussion will join us tomorrow to give us your opinion, because I think that after working in this kind of project for some years, it's very important to get critical comments and critical questions that will not become a group of people who think at the same time in the same way. So it's very good that somebody is critical. I love this question by Jaak and followed by Christina and followed by Letizia Tanka. So when and how and why we should have these measures to change the situation. So I want to give the word again to you, Vivian, and I really hope that most of you will join us tomorrow to go in depth in the discussion about what we can do at European level and what we can do in Informatics Europe. So Vivian, the floor is again yours. You have some few minutes again before we close and we have our lunch.
This debate can sort of also be, well, that does not only take place within ICT, but in academia in general. If there is that, should there be any, how much should we do to recruit more women? What kind of measures can we make? And most of the measures that I have talked about today is not necessarily about privileging women in particular. It's also about enhancing quality, for instance, also about trying to attract a more diverse body of students, including women. And the question now, whether or not there should be women-only measures or spaces, etc. Well, from the research and CIGIS, there were very different experiences with that. But in some cases, it was actually quite instrumental in trying to make a community for women also that was helpful for women, particularly when women was in a very small minority. It was not easy to be the only woman, so to speak, in a large class of only men students, etc. So it was important to gain a critical mass of women in order for women to sort of thrive in the. That doesn't necessarily have to be associated with giving them any kind of. This was mainly social measures. And they were also making some or producing themselves some courses, etc. That was sort of helpful, but that was also arranged by themselves. So I don't see really that it has to be a very big problem, or that the problem is so big that it sort of can't be compensated by the advantages of having such measures. So as Letizia is saying here, how shall we ever solve this problem if we don't take such kind of measures? So I think it is, one should perhaps consider to make some radical measures if there is a very small minority of women in order to get a process sort of going. Or otherwise, you can also use a wide range of measures that sort of are aiming at improving quality, widening the access to the programs, thinking differently in terms of how to recruit students and how to recruit perhaps a wider diversity of students, as they did in Carnegie Mellon. That has been a very important way of sort of sustaining a high proportion of a diverse student population. So there's no one recipe here. There's no one silver bullet in a way. You need to think about many things at the same time if you're going to make changes.
I want to thank you, Vivian, very, very much again for giving this talk to us. And I want to thank the audience for being so engaged and asking all the questions. I wish you all have a nice break now, and I'm looking forward to see you again at 2 o'clock. We will have our prizes for education and for gender balance. So Vivian, if you have some time, I would love you to join us for the awards ceremony, because then you will learn who will get the prize, the gender prize in Europe this year. And I really hope, if you don't have other commitments, that you will stay with us for at least for the awards. Thank you very much, Vivian. Thank you all. Have a nice break.
Thank you so much.